In order to understand why post-war reforms shocked Japanese civilians so deeply, it is essential to look carefully at the role of women before and during the war, because for generations their position had been shaped by tradition, law, and expectation in ways that left almost no room for independence. In pre-modern times, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the family system was strict and patriarchal. Women's identities were tied to the household, and loyalty to fathers, husbands, and sons defined their place. Education for girls was minimal, usually confined to moral lessons and basic literacy, often through instructional texts that emphasized modesty, obedience, and service. As Japan entered the Meiji era in the late 19th century and modernized rapidly, one might imagine that women would gain more freedom, but modernization actually codified restrictions. The Meiji Civil Code of 1898 legally placed the household, or i.e., at the center of social organization. Under this system, the male head of household held authority over all family members. Wives and daughters had no independent rights. Their legal identity was bound to the family patriarch, and their options in education, employment, and property ownership were tightly controlled. Marriage was not just a union of two individuals, but a continuation of family lines, and women were expected to preserve honor by loyalty and domestic skill. Social ideals of the time crystallized into the phrase, "good wife, wise mother." This slogan became both an aspiration and a cage. It told women they had a duty to raise healthy children and support their husbands, and it implied that anything beyond this was unnecessary, even dangerous. Schools reinforced this message. Girls were taught basic academic subjects, but were also trained in sewing, cooking, and etiquette. Lessons in patriotism and moral discipline reminded them that their purpose was to create stable families that would serve the state. Ambition outside the home was discouraged, and women who sought professional careers or political voice faced stigma. While some pioneers did push boundaries, activists who campaigned for women's rights, writers who questioned traditions, teachers who sought greater opportunities, most were marginalized and ignored by mainstream society. By the 1920s and 1930s, Japan was becoming increasingly militarized, and the space for women's independence narrowed even further. The government promoted the image of the devoted wife and mother as central to national strength. Propaganda emphasized self-sacrifice, modesty, and loyalty to the emperor. Women's organizations were co-opted into state service, encouraging mothers to raise patriotic children and wives to support their husbands' work or military service. Politics remained entirely closed to them. They had no voting rights and no opportunity to shape laws that governed their lives. The Diet, Japan's parliament, was exclusively male, and debates about the nation's future excluded half the population. Still, everyday reality was more complex. Many women worked in textile factories, shops, or farms, especially those from poorer families. In urban areas, women found jobs in offices, cafes, or as teachers. Yet their wages were far lower than men's, and opportunities for advancement were almost non-existent. Their contributions were vital to the economy, but they were treated as temporary workers whose main destiny remained marriage. This contradiction, indispensable labor without recognition, would only deepen once war broke out. When Japan entered full-scale conflict in China in the late 1930s and later expanded into the Pacific, the demands on the population grew enormous. Millions of men were drafted into military service, leaving gaps in factories, farms, and offices. Women were expected to fill those gaps, and the state mobilized them more aggressively than ever before. The government organized female volunteer corps, mobilizing young women to work in munitions plants, produce uniforms, or serve as nurses. Housewives took on agricultural work, growing crops to support food supplies. High school girls were sent to factories instead of classrooms, riveting airplane parts, packing ammunition, or sorting military supplies. These were not symbolic tasks. They were grueling, often dangerous, and absolutely essential to the war effort. In cities, women managed rationing systems, queuing for scarce food, and improvising meals from whatever they could find. Shortages became severe as the war dragged on. Soap, clothing, and basic staples disappeared, forcing families to reuse, repair, or go without. Women were the ones who bore the daily struggle of survival, trading with neighbors, bartering on black markets, or inventing recipes from scraps. At the same time, they carried the emotional burden of separation. Husbands, brothers, and sons were sent to battlefields far away, often never to return. Letters, when they arrived, were treasured fragments of connection. Widows multiplied as casualties mounted, and mothers had to raise children alone with little support. Air raids brought new terrors. Allied bombings destroyed major cities, leaving families homeless overnight. Women carried children on their backs through burning streets, searched for relatives in the rubble, and rebuilt makeshift shelters from charred remains. They organized community fire brigades, digging wells and preparing buckets of water to fight flames. Some were evacuated with children to the countryside, torn from their homes and families, enduring hunger and fear in unfamiliar places. All of this demanded immense strength, but recognition remained absent. Official propaganda praised women as loyal supporters of the nation, yet always in relation to men, never as individuals with their own rights. Their work was framed as duty, not empowerment, even as women proved themselves capable of sustaining entire industries and communities under wartime pressure. They were still legally excluded from political life. They could not vote, they had no representatives, and they had no voice in the decisions that sent their loved ones to die. By the final years of the war, the situation had become catastrophic. Bombings leveled entire neighborhoods. Food shortages became starvation. Mothers skipped meals so their children could eat. Women walked miles to forage for roots, leaves, or anything edible. Malnutrition spread, and sickness followed. Families huddled in air raid shelters, listening to bombs fall and wondering if they would see morning. For many, the promises of tradition, that devotion to family and emperor would provide stability, collapsed entirely. The war revealed how fragile those assurances were, and how little protection obedience could bring. Yet, even in these desperate conditions, women demonstrated resilience. They kept households functioning without men. They adapted to shortages with creativity. They organized communities for mutual aid. They shouldered responsibilities that society had never formally acknowledged. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, women were among the most exhausted survivors. They had endured years of hardship and loss. They had proven capable of independence and leadership, but they remained invisible in the nation's official structures. Their legal status was unchanged and their voices unheard. The contradiction was glaring. Women had sustained the country in its darkest years, yet had no place in shaping its future. This is the background against which post-war reforms would arrive. To the outside world, and later to many Japanese themselves, it seemed astonishing that women who had been bound by centuries of obedience could suddenly gain political rights. But to understand that shock, one must first see how deep the restrictions had been, and how bitter the collapse that revealed them. For generations, Japanese women had been taught that obedience was their highest duty, and that service to family and nation was their only destiny. During the war, they discovered their own capacity for endurance and responsibility, but their society refused to acknowledge it. When the old order finally crumbled in defeat, the possibility of transformation opened suddenly and dramatically. And that is why the reforms to come would feel so unbelievable to those who had lived through the years of tradition and collapse. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, its people faced a reality they had never imagined: occupation by a foreign power. The old structures of authority had collapsed, cities were in ruins, and survival was uncertain. Into this vacuum stepped the Allied forces led by the United States, and with them came reforms that would transform Japanese society in ways that civilians could scarcely believe. At the center of these changes stood General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers. MacArthur and his staff saw democratization as essential for Japan's future. To them, the war had been fueled by militarism, authoritarianism, and a rigid social order that gave ordinary people little voice. If Japan was to avoid repeating its past, those structures had to be dismantled. Among the most striking of the reforms was the decision to expand rights for women. To Japanese civilians in 1945, this was a radical departure from everything they had known. Women had been excluded from politics, confined legally to subordinate roles, and celebrated mainly as mothers and wives. Suddenly, under the eyes of the occupation, they were told they would have a new place in the nation. The idea seemed almost unreal. MacArthur's team moved quickly. In 1946, they oversaw the drafting of a new constitution that would reshape the legal framework of the country. At the heart of this constitution, which came into effect in 1947, was Article 14, guaranteeing equality under the law without discrimination based on sex. This single provision struck at centuries of tradition that had tied women's identities to obedience within the household. For the first time, equality was written into the foundation of Japanese governance. Even more shocking was Article 24, which addressed family life directly. It declared that marriage would be based on mutual consent and equal rights of husband and wife. This was revolutionary in a society where family law had long placed women under the authority of male heads of household. The Civil Code was rewritten to reflect these principles, dismantling the old IE system and giving women new legal standing in family and property matters. But perhaps the most dramatic and visible change was the right to vote. In December 1945, women were granted suffrage, and just months later, in April 1946, they went to the polls for the first time in Japanese history. More than 13 million women cast ballots in that election, a staggering image for a country where only men had ever been seen as participants in politics. The sight of women standing in line to vote, ballots in hand, was described by observers as almost surreal. Newspapers published photographs of housewives, factory workers, and young women in school uniforms stepping into polling stations. To many Japanese men, and even to many women, it felt like an entirely new world had arrived overnight. The shock deepened when the results were announced. 39 women won seats in the lower house of the Diet, Japan's parliament. For the first time, women stood among men in the halls of government, speaking, debating, and shaping laws. Their very presence was symbolic. Civilians who had grown up believing that politics was the sole domain of men now saw women in positions of authority. The image alone carried weight. Women parliamentarians spoke about education, labor rights, family policy, and welfare. Their voices were still a minority, but they signaled a profound break from the past. Reforms extended beyond politics. Women gained greater access to education as schools and universities opened doors that had long been closed. Enrollment of girls in secondary and higher education expanded dramatically. Suddenly, the idea that a daughter could pursue studies alongside her brother was no longer unthinkable. Textbooks were rewritten to remove militarist and authoritarian ideals, replacing them with democratic values. For girls who had been taught that their destiny was to become good wives, wise mothers, these new classrooms presented possibilities their mothers could scarcely imagine. Workplaces also began to change. Legal reforms outlawed discrimination in employment, at least on paper, and women entered new professions in greater numbers. Nurses, teachers, clerks, and office workers found that their labor was no longer seen as merely temporary until marriage. Economic necessity in the ruined post-war years reinforced this trend, as families needed every member to contribute to survival. Women's visible participation in the workforce was no longer unusual, and legal equality gave them new ground to demand fair treatment. Yet the changes were not greeted with uniform acceptance. For many men, particularly from older generations, the sight of women voting, speaking in parliament, or studying in universities was unsettling. Some considered it an erosion of tradition, a loss of the social harmony that had defined family life for centuries. In rural areas especially, where customs were strongest, resistance was pronounced. Fathers who once dictated their daughters' futures struggled to accept that marriage now required a woman's full consent. Husbands who had grown up believing themselves heads of households faced the unfamiliar language of equality. Even among women, reactions were complex. For some, the new rights were liberating and exhilarating. For others, they were bewildering, even frightening. Many housewives who had never imagined themselves as political actors felt unprepared for the responsibilities of voting. Some questioned whether they truly belonged in public life. After years of propaganda telling them their worth lay in domestic service, the sudden shift to public participation was disorienting. Still, the reforms had momentum. American occupation authorities promoted women's rights as a cornerstone of democracy. Japanese activists, many of whom had struggled for decades to expand opportunities, seized the moment to push further. Women's organizations flourished, encouraging participation in civic life, organizing lectures and supporting female candidates. Newspapers featured profiles of women parliamentarians, presenting them as symbols of the new Japan. One of the most visible figures was Kato Shizue, a longtime advocate for women's rights and social reform. She had campaigned for suffrage long before the occupation and now became one of the first women elected to the Diet. Her presence gave continuity to the struggle, showing that these reforms were not simply imposed from outside, but also built on years of Japanese activism. For civilians, however, the pace of change remained staggering. Within less than 2 years, women had gone from complete exclusion to active participation in the nation's political life. The transformation was so rapid that many could hardly process it. Diaries and newspapers from the time reveal amazement at the sight of women speaking in public meetings, attending rallies, or addressing classrooms as teachers. To those who had lived through the war and its hardships, the contrast was extreme. Only months earlier, women had been queuing for food, laboring in factories, and enduring air raids with little acknowledgement of their agency. Now, they were casting ballots and shaping laws. The psychological shock of this reversal cannot be overstated. For men, it meant adjusting to a society where authority was no longer exclusively theirs. For women, it meant stepping into roles for which they had no precedent, learning quickly to navigate rights and responsibilities that had been denied for centuries. Everyday life began to reflect these new realities. Town meetings now included female participants, schools saw girls continue education beyond primary levels, and workplaces slowly adjusted to mixed-gender environments. In villages and cities alike, the image of women as active citizens took root, even if uneasily. Not everyone welcomed the changes, but no one could deny them. Women had become visible in public life in a way that would have been unimaginable before the war. To civilians who had grown up believing politics was men's domain and obedience was women's duty, this visibility was astonishing. It represented a break not just with wartime experience, but with centuries of tradition. That is why, when people later recalled those early post-war years, they often spoke of disbelief. Seeing women vote, seeing women elected, seeing women speak in parliament or attend university, these were images that challenged the very foundations of Japanese identity. The reforms of the occupation period reshaped the nation's political and social structure, but they also reshaped imagination itself, altering what Japanese civilians believed was possible. From the outside, these reforms may seem logical steps in democratization. From within Japan, they were a cultural earthquake. They signaled not just a change in law, but a redefinition of what it meant to be a citizen, a daughter, a wife, or a mother. Women, once invisible in public life, now stood as symbols of a new democracy. For many civilians, it felt unbelievable, almost surreal, but the evidence was before their eyes. Women were no longer confined to silence. They were voters, lawmakers, and participants in the building of a new Japan. In the years that followed the sweeping reforms of the occupation, the everyday lives of Japanese women began to shift in ways that were visible in every corner of society. These changes did not happen overnight, nor were they experienced the same way by every woman. But across cities, villages, schools, and workplaces, the impact of new rights and opportunities became impossible to ignore. One of the most significant transformations appeared in education. Before the war, girls' schooling had been limited and focused on preparing them for domestic life. After the reforms, schools opened their doors to female students on equal terms. Girls not only attended primary and secondary schools in greater numbers, but also entered universities and specialized colleges that had previously excluded them. Textbooks no longer told them that their destiny was confined to the home. Instead, they were encouraged to imagine futures as teachers, doctors, scientists, and professionals. For families, this was a cultural shock. Fathers who had once expected daughters to marry young now found them preparing for exams, joining study groups, and speaking about careers. In classrooms, boys and girls studied side by side, sometimes for the first time. The image of young women carrying books on crowded trains to attend lectures was itself a symbol of the new Japan. The workforce also changed dramatically. During the war, women had been pushed into factories and fields by necessity. After the war, many continued to work, not just out of necessity but also with new legal protections. Offices, schools, hospitals, and government bureaus began to employ women in larger numbers. While wages were still unequal and discrimination persisted, the simple fact that women could now enter professions with a measure of respect signaled a profound break with the past. Female teachers trained new generations, female nurses expanded hospital care, and female clerks filled roles in government offices. In cities, it became increasingly common to see women commuting to work, dressed in modern clothing and carrying briefcases. These everyday images were powerful reminders of how much had changed. Social life, too, began to open. Women joined neighborhood associations not just as helpers, but as active participants with voices of their own. They attended town meetings, community discussions, and even political rallies. In rural areas, this could be especially startling. Farmers who had grown up in the old system found their wives and daughters standing up in village halls to speak about schools, health clinics, or local budgets. For many men, especially older generations, this was unsettling. The idea that a wife could express opinions in public, that a daughter could choose her husband freely, or that a female neighbor could campaign for local office challenged centuries of custom. Resistance took many forms. Some men mocked the new roles. Others tried to discourage women from voting or working outside the home. In families, arguments erupted as young women sought education or employment against the wishes of traditional fathers. Stories circulated of husbands demanding their wives give up political activity or criticizing female workers as neglecting their domestic duties. Yet the momentum of change was difficult to stop. Economic necessity in post-war Japan required the contributions of everyone. The rapid reconstruction of cities, the growth of new industries, and the rebuilding of infrastructure all depended on labor. Women's participation was no longer optional. And with participation came visibility. Newspapers ran stories about women entrepreneurs opening small businesses, female teachers inspiring new generations, and young women enrolling in universities at record numbers. The press often portrayed them as symbols of the new democratic spirit. Popular magazines showed images of women voting, studying, or working in offices, contrasting them with the older images of wartime sacrifice. To many civilians, these images were astonishing. Only a few years earlier, women had been portrayed exclusively as supportive figures in the background. Now they were depicted as active agents in shaping the country's future. Everyday routines reflected this shift. A mother might prepare her children for school in the morning, then head to her own workplace or attend a community meeting. A daughter might study late into the night for an exam, determined to enter a university once reserved for men. Housewives who once felt confined to the home found themselves reading newspapers, discussing politics, or even campaigning for local causes. In urban neighborhoods, women formed study groups to learn about democracy, law, and economics, eager to make sense of their new rights. These changes were not always smooth. Balancing work, education, and domestic responsibilities created new pressures. Many women carried a double burden. Expected to succeed in the public sphere while still maintaining traditional household duties. Critics argued that the reforms had gone too far, too quickly, that Japan was losing its cultural foundation. But for younger generations, the new opportunities were embraced as natural. Girls who grew up after the war saw education and participation not as shocking, but as their rightful place. For them, the cultural shock belonged to their parents and grandparents who struggled to adjust to a world where women no longer bowed silently to authority. Over time, women became enduring symbols of the transformation of Japanese society. Their presence in schools, workplaces, and public assemblies signaled that democracy was not just a foreign idea imposed by the occupation, but something lived daily by ordinary people. Civilians could not help but notice. A woman speaking at a community meeting, a young student reading in a university library, a parliamentarian addressing the Diet. These were images that told the public that Japan had changed. For many, It was still unbelievable. How could a society that had so recently demanded obedience from women now ask for their opinions and grant them rights? The disbelief was part of the transformation itself, a reminder of how dramatic the shift had been. In just a few short years, Japanese women had gone from invisible to visible, from silent to outspoken, from restricted to recognized. And in doing so, they became the most powerful symbols of Japan's rebirth as a democracy. Their new roles reminded everyone that the old world was gone, and a new one had taken its place. These everyday transformations were not simply about work or school. They were about redefining what it meant to be a citizen in Japan. Women carried that message in their daily lives, and civilians could not ignore the change. If you found this story of transformation as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the sudden shift in women's rights was the most shocking part of Japan's post-war changes? Or were there other transformations that surprised society even more? We'd love to hear your perspective.